Obama shows confidence in Iowa sprint. Waterloo, Iowa. Senator Barack Obama is striving to seize on a moment of opportunity in the final weeks before the Iowa caucuses to challenge Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton's long dominance of the Democratic field, even as he faces intensified questions about his vulnerabilities in a general election. These days, he barely acknowledges Mrs. Clinton when he speaks to Iowa voters, but he finds himself at the center of a fusillade of criticism from his rivals, including a fresh assertion from former President Bill Clinton that electing Mr. Obama would be rolling the dice for America. Addressing the shift in sentiment about his prospects of beating Mrs. Clinton in Iowa and holding her off in New Hampshire and other states that follow, Mr. Obama said in an interview, "A month ago I was an idiot. This month I'm a genius." The campaign of Mr. Obama, which slogged uncertainty through a period of the late summer and fall, alarming contributors who feared he might have missed his moment, is now brimming with confidence as he delivers a closing argument to Iowa voters. His speeches are noticeably crisper, his poise is more consistent, and many supporters say they no longer must rely upon a leap of faith or a leap of faith to envision him winning the nomination. With 1 week remaining before the campaigning pauses for Christmas, Mr. Obama is dazzing and dashing and dashing through a 22-city tour from the Mississippi River in the east to the Missouri River in the west, rushing to lock in support before a holiday interlude. His organization is facing its greatest test yet, turning enthusiasm among many grassroots Democrats into widespread support on January 3rd in precincts that will decide the outcome, particularly rural areas where his support remains uneven. As he traveled across Iowa a month ago, the chief element of Mr. Obama's pitch was to draw stark contrast with Mrs. Clinton, urging voters to consider whether she had been truthful in explaining her positions. One of the few mentions he made of her about his rival here Saturday was to respond to criticism by associates of the Clinton campaign that he is too inexperienced and his background is unexamined. I understand that there's a history of politics being all about slash and burn and taking folks down. I recall the Clintons themselves calling the politics of personal destruction, which they decried. Mr. Obama told reporters at a news conference here Saturday, "My suspicion is that's just not where the country's at right now. They are not interested in politics as a blood sport." Yet despite a fresh sense of confidence surrounding Mr. Obama, the race in Iowa remains unsettled. Many voters are still making up their minds, or open to changing them, as the 6 major Democratic candidates unleash advertising barrages urging voters to consider the gravity of the election. While strategists for Mr. Obama said they believed he had sufficiently answered questions about his experience, fresh doubts are being injected into the atmosphere of the race every day. The latest comes through an advertisement from Senator Joseph R. Biden Jr. of Delaware, who says being president is not the same as running for president. Still, Mr. Obama finds himself in the tightest competition with Mrs. Clinton, who has dropped her above the fray posture and become more combative in recent weeks. But even more directly with former Senator John Edwards of North Carolina, who placed second here in 2004 and has staked his candidacy on a strong showing. Mr. Edwards released a new television advertisement on Saturday saying, "Saving the middle class is going to be an epic battle, and that's the fight I was born for." Reflecting concern about the quiet strength of Mr. Edwards' campaign, Mr. Obama briefly mentioned Mr. Edwards at a campaign stop in Independence on Saturday. Responding to criticism Mr. Edwards had voiced about Mr. Obama's health care plan, with the war having lost some of its intensity as a distinguishing point among Democratic candidates, other issues are coming to the fore, from health care and the weakening economy to which candidate is best suited to beating the Republicans in the fall. A variety of polls show Mr. Obama at worst to be in a dead heat with Mrs. Clinton in Iowa and strongly gaining on her in New Hampshire, where voters will go to the polls 5 days after the caucuses. Capitalizing on many Democrats see as a moment of vulnerability for Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Obama is seeking to remind voters of his judgment, temperament, and non-polarizing approach. At the same time, he has narrowed his focus to a micro level in Iowa, calling county sheriffs, local officials, and prospective precinct captains when he passes through in his passes through town. Before leaving Iowa for the weekend, Mrs. Clinton again forcefully, if obliquely, pressed the case that she is not only more experienced than Mr. Obama, but better able to take on what is sure to be an aggressive campaign by the Republican nominee. "I've been vetted," she told reporters Friday. "I've been tested. There are no surprises." An advisor to Mrs. Clinton's campaign suggested that this week that Mr. Obama's admission of drug use as a young man could weaken his candidacy should he win the general election. The Clinton campaign repudiated the marks. Mrs. Clinton apologized and the advisor resigned, but she and her aides have kept the issue alive by referring to it publicly a number of times in what appeared to be an effort to drive up negative views of his character and raise doubts about his ability to weather a general election. He will turn to drugs, they said. In an interview, Mr. Obama responded that voters would ultimately be turned off by such attacks on him, particularly about his admission more than a decade ago that he had used marijuana and cocaine in his youth. "My past and my character seemed to be fine when I was 20 points down," Mr. Obama said. "Those kinds of tactics or strategies, I think, are emblematic of old politics. It's exactly the kind of politics that the American people are tired of." In the final 18 days of the race here, Mr. Obama intends to devote nearly all his time to Iowa, with the exception of a 2-day trip to New Hampshire. He completed his final fundraising tour of this year on Tuesday in Seattle, which freed his schedule for 15-hour days of back-to-back rallies and town meetings, a pace far more hectic than much of the year. "The climate on the night of the caucuses is as important to turnout as anything," said David Plouffe, Mr. Obama's campaign manager, who traveled across the state with him. "Right now we have a good climate, but the next 20 days will seem like 20 years." In the closing weeks of the race, as volunteers make about 100,000 million phone calls every night on behalf of Mr. Obama, except on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, when the calls temporarily cease, they are given the task of collecting an answer to a new piece of information. "If you are going away for the holidays, will you be back by January 3rd? In such a tight race, Mr. Plouffe said, a margin of 2,000 or 3,000 could tip the balance. And that is why none of the candidates are leaving any possibilities to chance, from high school students who will be 18 by Election Day to older voters who are being gently asked to stick around blustery Iowa until the caucuses take place before moving to a warmer climate for the winter." As he reaches out to those voters, Mr. Obama implores upon them a heavy sense of responsibility. At the same time, though, he does seem to unwittingly raise expectations for his own campaign here, particularly if he doesn't win in Iowa and seems to move on to the February 5th contests for a second chance. "You in Iowa have this extraordinary privilege of choosing who the next president of the United States is going to be," Mr. Obama told an audience at the Lakeside Ballroom in Guttenberg, a town that overlooks the Mississippi River. "Whoever wins this caucus is likely to win the nomination and is likely to win the presidency."